The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The first thing Harry noticed was that the cupboard door had not been knocked from outside. The second thing he noticed, pulling it open, was Hermione Granger crouching in the hallway of number 4, Privet Drive. Leather satchel over one shoulder, a thick folder tucked under her arm bound with 2 elastic bands, and what appeared to be a sticking charm, and hair in a state that he hadn't thought was achievable even for her. "Bloodlink emergency transit," she said, before he could speak. "I've been building the framework since 3rd year. It routes through our magical entanglement, the bond that formed during the troll incident in 1st year. The trace doesn't register it because it operates at a frequency the Ministry's detection charms don't monitor. It isn't standard underage magic, it's something considerably older." She glanced past him into the cupboard, then at his face. Her expression wasn't pity. Hermione's expressions never contained pity, but it held the focused anger of someone who had found a structural problem and intended to correct it. "We need to leave. I've written a note for your relatives." She held out a folded piece of paper. He read it. "Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, Harry is departing for an extended educational program. He will return when the educational program is complete. Please ensure his belongings are held safely. Regards, Hermione Granger, Academy representative," he said. "It will make sense shortly." He picked up the empty cage that had held Hedwig before Vernon locked her away on the grounds that owls were a nuisance. He was getting Hedwig back. That was not negotiable. He followed Hermione out the front door into the July morning, 3 days after the Ministry of Magic had sat across from him in a briefing room and dismissed everything he had said about Cedric Diggory as the delusions of a traumatized boy. He'd been in the cupboard since then, thinking. The waking version of what he'd witnessed in that graveyard wasn't nightmare. Those came at 3 a.m, green and final and tasting of copper. What occupied his daylight hours was something different, an analytical accounting of what had actually happened versus what the system was willing to acknowledge. Cedric was dead. Harry had told the truth. The minister had sat across from him with an expression of composed disbelief and made a series of decisions about what the public could usefully know. He had been thinking clearly enough in the subsequent days to understand that the system wasn't merely broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, to protect itself rather than the people inside it. The question, until this morning, had been what to do about it. The back booth of the leaky cauldron smelled of old wood and something faintly alchemical. Hermione had booked it under a false name charm. The barmaid addressed Harry as Mr. Pemberton without a flicker of recognition. The folder between them on the table was 40 dense pages, organized with the intensity of someone who had been unable to sleep for several weeks and had found a more productive use for the hours. He read every page. She let him, which was one of the things he valued about her. She understood when words would be less useful than silence. When he finished, he set down the last page. "We're not students anymore," he said. "If we do this." Something moved across her face. Genuine, unguarded grief. The expression of someone leaving behind a place they had loved before they understood it was too small. "No, we'd be founders. Founders don't go back to class in September. No." The grief steadied into something forward-facing and firm. "But they build something better." He looked at the folder. The central document was Hermione's translation of a provision she'd found in the Gringotts archive, Rowena Ravenclaw's own legal clause, preserved for 10 centuries, never invoked. The language was formal and irreversible and entirely clear. The legitimate heirs of the founding blood shall retain the right and the duty to withdraw their ancestral essence from the stones of the castle, to carry the sovereign seat elsewhere. He read it a second time. "When do we go to Gringotts?" Director Ragnarok received them in the Founder's Suite, a chamber Harry hadn't known existed, its walls lined with original magical contracts under permanent stasis charms, ink still dark in languages that predated English. Ragnarok listened to Hermione's 5-section presentation for 90 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he set his hands flat on his desk and asked exactly one question. "Are you prepared for the war this will cause?" "We're already in one," Harry said. The lineage crucible was a stone basin filled with liquid that moved like mercury and caught light like neither metal nor water. The goblin notary, older than most things in the room, stood at its edge with a record book, whose pages were thicker than standard parchment. Harry placed his hand on the surface. The liquid shifted immediately to deep crimson gold. The notary's quill moved without hesitation. Harry James Potter. Confirmed heir. Gryffindor line. Warriors standing. Then, Hermione. She placed her palm flat on the basin. The liquid held still. 3 seconds. 5. A junior clerk shifted his weight. 10. 20. Ragnarok watched with the composure of a professional who had seen many things and was prepared to add one more to the list. Then the basin changed. Not to Ravenclaw's blue bronze. To something older than that distinction, a luminous deep blue that pulsed with silver. The color of water meeting starlight, suggesting intellect and navigation and the patience of someone who had spent a long time being right about difficult things before the world caught up. The notary set his quill down, then picked it up again. It should be noted that this lineage system, the Crucible's recognition of heirs, operated by a magical standard older than the Ministry itself, one that Gringotts archivists had preserved precisely because it predated every governmental framework that had since tried to supersede it. It measured something closer to magical affinity and intellectual inheritance than genealogy in any conventional sense. What the Crucible recognized in Hermione Jean Granger was not her parentage. It was her. Hermione Jean Granger, the notary said in a voice that carried unmistakable professional respect. Magic true heir, Ravenclaw line. Wisdom's standing. Third confirmed case in recorded history. Congratulations, young scholar. Hermione said nothing. The basin's light reflected in her face. Her hand, Harry noticed, was shaking, barely, but enough. He reached over and took it. She pressed his fingers hard. Then she released, straightened, and turned to Ragnarok. Right, she said. What do we sign? They signed everything. Deep in the stones of a Scottish castle, something vast and ancient began, without noise or ceremony, to shift. Not violently, no walls cracked, no alarm rang across the highlands. It was quieter than violence and more permanent. A slow withdrawal, like a breath held for 10 centuries, finally released. They stood outside Gringotts at sunrise with folders under their arms. The street was empty in the manner of early mornings when the city hasn't yet decided to be itself. Harry looked up at the pale gold sky. Stars not quite gone. We're going to need a boat, he said. The goblin chartered vessel set them on dark sand in the early afternoon of a Thursday in early July, and the moment Harry's boots touched the beach, he felt it, a current of recognition moving upward through the ground and into his chest, like a chord resolving after years of dissonance. Hermione felt it differently. She stopped at the waterline, both feet planted, notebook already open, writing faster than she could think. The island introduced itself through the soles of their feet. They walked every inch of it that afternoon, Harry navigating by instinct, the ground communicating preference through ease or resistance underfoot. Hermione working with a compass and a cartographic charm she'd adapted from a specialist text sourced through Gringotts' lending archive. By evening they had produced a site survey, a magical density map with 3 zones of high concentration, and a preliminary structural plan. Between them on a fire Dobby had built on the beach set the first meal served at what would become the Academy of Emeries, the island's native plants yielding flavor profiles no kitchen had yet catalogued. They ate without speaking. The stars over the island had no competition from any human light for 40 miles, and they were accordingly magnificent. Architectural sorcery was nothing like transfiguration. Harry had assumed it would be similar. Matter, form, the imposition of change. He was wrong within 30 seconds of their first attempt. Transfiguration overrode what a thing was. Architectural sorcery asked what a thing was already becoming, then accelerated the process. The first 3 attempts at raising the hall's central wall were educational in the way comprehensive failure was educational. The results could generously be described as rubble with ambition. Harry laughed at the 3rd attempt, genuinely, without restraint. At the pile of stones that had definitively declined to become a wall. Hermione regarded it for a long moment with real irritation. Then the irritation broke, and she laughed too, which was rarer and therefore more valuable, and they stood in the ruins of their third failure and let the laughing finish itself. Then she picked up her notebook. "The stone doesn't want to go up," Harry said after extending his awareness outward through the ground. "It wants to go deep first." "Foundation first," she said, already writing. "We've been approaching this architecturally when the methodology is geological. Over 4 weeks, with Dobby's 63 house elves, who approached architectural sorcery with the focused delight of beings who had organized space for centuries and were finally doing so with genuine purpose, the Academy of Emeries took shape. The foundation stone came first, a piece of island granite, massive, carried by a sustained wandless working that left Harry sitting on the ground for 20 minutes. When he recovered, they placed their palms on it simultaneously, sealing the air bond into the stone's core. The island accepted this with the certainty of something that had been waiting precisely for this. The hall followed, not a castle, not a Gothic tower, nothing borrowed from Hogwarts vocabulary. A dome, open to the island's sky through a permeability charm that admitted starlight and moonlight while declining rain and cold. 8 hours of sustained work, and when it finished, the dome caught the afternoon light in frequencies that had no names in conventional optics. Colors between colors. Harry pressed his hand to the finished stone and felt the island's satisfaction as a vibration in his palm. Then the library. 6 stories of open shelving, a reading terrace on the 3rd floor overlooking the eastern lake, and a cataloging system Hermione spent 3 days designing, organized by conceptual relationship rather than subject category, so that a student researching any given topic would find its connected disciplines naturally nearby. Dormitories followed, integrated into the island's contours rather than imposed upon them. No house colors. No divisions. Rooms matched to their occupants by an affinity process neither of them fully understood, but both chose to trust. Last came the ward weaving. Harry anchored the perimeter, his magic, drawn up through the foundation stone and amplified through the air bond, forming the load-bearing structure of a protective architecture that covered every point of the island's edge and the complete spatial volume above it. He stood at the cliff's edge in the second morning's first light and extended everything he had outward, and the island gave it back amplified. Hermione wove the intelligence layer. Ward structures without cognitive architecture were blunt instruments. They stopped things without understanding them. The layer she constructed over Harry's foundation could read magical signatures, assess intent, identify known threat patterns, and, most crucially, learn. Every interaction with the boundary would refine its responses. The wards would improve with use. Together, 39 hours of continuous work. When the final sequence completed, they were flat on their backs in the grass, staring at a sky that was either very late night or very early morning. Every muscle Harry owned had its own opinion about the past 2 days. But the island was warm around them. The wards held at the perimeter, present without pressing, the mark of good protective magic, which didn't announce itself but was simply completely there. Better than modern Hogwarts? Harry said, to the sky. By every measurable parameter, Hermione said to the same sky. You measured. I've been measuring since day 1. On the first morning of August, the birds appeared. Not summoned, arrived 34 of them, emerging from the island's northern forest at dawn, in a formation that suggested neither accident nor training but something between, the natural organization of creatures that understood their function. Their feathers were the silver of moonlight on still water, and their eyes, when they settled on the branches outside the hall, held the attention of very old, very patient things. Hermione identified them before breakfast from Ravenclaw's bestiary fragment. Concordia argenti, silver-feathered messenger birds native to magical islands, paired to recipients not by instruction, but by an instinctive matching process. She read the relevant passage twice, added 3 annotations, then looked up at the 34 birds arranged on the branches outside the windows. We didn't call them, Harry said. No, she said. I think they were waiting for the same thing the island was waiting for. She went back to her annotations. The letters were drafted over 2 days, Hermione writing, Harry reading drafts, both revising until the result was cleaner and more precise than either would have managed alone. 2 categories, distinct in purpose and tone. The first, 30 personal invitations, each one naming something true about the recipient that a form letter couldn't contain. Hermione had been keeping records since second year, not formally, but with a researcher's habit of noticing patterns. 16 Muggle-born students whose exam results consistently underrepresented their actual magical ability. The core group that would have formed, in another timeline, the Da. 3 students whose situations at Hogwarts under the incoming administration she had assessed as untenable. The second, a formal open announcement to the full Hogwarts student body. Distributed by Gringotts certified mail on September's first morning. Not an invitation, a notification. The academy existed. Its doors were open. What any student did with that information was entirely their own decision. Harry addressed the formal letters. Hermione sealed them with the academy's dual sigil, a lion and an eagle, interlocked. Pressed in ink that was not quite any color existing in natural light. When the 34th envelope was sealed, the 34th bird descended from its branch and accepted it from her hand with the composed authority of something that had always known this moment was coming. 34 silver shapes dispersed across the country in the August morning, and Harry watched them until they were gone. At his grandmother Augusta's breakfast table in Devon, Neville Longbottom was working through his third piece of toast when the silver bird landed directly on his shoulder. Not near him, on him, as though it had coordinates. He held very still. The bird weighed almost nothing, and smelled of apples and ozone. And it waited with a patience that suggested no competing appointments. He took the letter. Read it again. His grandmother watched his expression change in a way she had seen very rarely across 15 years. Not the pleasant mild courtesy that was his social default. Not the particular stricken look he produced when he'd broken something. But something she recognized because she had seen it once before. The expression of someone being offered exactly what they needed at the exact moment they were capable of receiving it. She took the letter when he offered it. Read it twice, as he had. Set it on the table beside her teacup with the precision of someone managing an unexpectedly strong response. Gringotts, notary seal. This is the first serious legal challenge to Ministry Educational Authority in 200 years. I know, Gran. She looked at her grandson. At the letter. At her grandson again. Your mother and father, she said. And stopped. Started again. They would have been proud. I know, Gran, he said. And his voice was steady in the way voices were steady when a decision had already been made before the sentence began. And the steadiness was simply its external evidence. The silver bird stayed on his shoulder through all of it. It departed only when he stood to start packing, rising from him with the quiet efficiency of a completed task. Luna Lovegood was in her garden when hers arrived, attempting to teach a young Snargaluff sapling to waltz, an endeavor progressing better than most people would have predicted. Because most people underestimated the Snargaluff's natural responsiveness to rhythm, and because Luna's approach to teaching anything was to first understand what the thing wanted to learn, and then find the overlap between that and what she hoped to convey. The silver bird landed on a fence post 3 feet away and regarded her with the recognition of something that had found exactly who it was looking for. She read the letter with the unhurried completeness she brought to everything. Then, she set it carefully on the post, finished the foxtrot lesson, and went inside. Her father Xenophilius was at his press, setting type for the next quibbler. He looked at his daughter's face as she came through the door and understood immediately that something had shifted. She showed him the letter. He read it. Will you be happy there? He asked. Not should you go, simply whether she would be happy. I think I'll be real there, she said. He thought about 15 years of watching his daughter describe the world she actually perceived to people who insisted her perceptions were errors, and what it might mean for her to be somewhere that treated perception as data, rather than delusion. He helped her pack. The Snargaluff sapling, visible through the garden window, executed a reasonably competent foxtrot by itself. The twins received a joint letter, a single bird carrying a single envelope addressed to both of them, which told Fred and George immediately that whoever had written it understood something important about how they processed information. Together, always. Each completing what the other had started before, either noticed it beginning. They read it simultaneously. When they finished, Fred looked at George. George looked at Fred. The wordless exchange lasted 4 seconds and covered considerably more ground than that. No restrictions on experimental magic, George said. Umbridge is going to be High Inquisitor, Fred said. I was packed last Tuesday, George said. I was packed on Thursday, Fred said. Of last week. They both looked at the lion and eagle sigil catching the morning light, and they smiled the smile of people who have arrived exactly where they belong, a rare and specific expression that most people never produce at all, and they began assembling the contents of their workshop for transport. Across Britain, in 14 other homes, silver birds arrived at breakfast tables and garden walls and bedroom windows. Each one found its recipient with the same unhurried certainty, waiting, not hovering, not insistent, simply present, until the letter was read and understood. Some needed an hour. Some needed a night. A few wrote back with questions, and Hermione answered each one the same day. Precise, unambiguous. Faintly bracing in the manner of certainty when you're accustomed to reassurances that deliberately avoid saying anything solid. None were coerced. The letters named what was being offered, what it cost, and left the decision entirely to the person holding it. We don't want students who came because they felt pressured, Hermione had said during drafting. We want students who chose. Harry agreed, and also suspected she was right for reasons beyond strategy. On the evening that August began, 34 silver birds rose from various points across the country and reversed course, converging on the island from every compass direction simultaneously, settling back into the northern forest as the day ended. The replies, 29 confirmations, 3 requests for additional information, 2 who needed more time, Hermione organized by arrival date in a leather folder beside the Academy's founding documents. She was already writing orientation materials before the last bird returned. Harry was already thinking about the ward visitor protocol. Outside, the island's apple trees carried their impossible fruit through the August dark, and 34 lives across Britain were, quietly and irrevocably, rerouting, when September arrived, the first morning of it, sky not yet committed to its color. Harry and Hermione came to Hogsmeade via a transit method that left no trace on the platform's monitoring systems because it operated under ICW, primary charter authorization rather than ministry, registered transportation channels. The silver-blue cascade that rose from the cobblestones and was gone in under a second was witnessed by a station worker who blinked twice and found he had no particular interest in investigating, which was a known side effect of sovereign transit. They stood on the Hogsmeade platform in robes that were nothing like school uniforms. Harry wore deep red with gold detailing, Gryffindor's colors, but carrying the weight of someone representing something rather than belonging to it. Hermione wore deep blue with silver, the same intentional formality. Neither carried wands visibly. They looked like people with somewhere specific to be. The express arrived slightly late due to an incident near Carlisle that several sixth years claimed involved a niffler and a conductor's hat. Students poured onto the platform. The crowd had the texture of all September arrivals, families collapsing into the relief of completing the journey, trunks dragging across cobblestones, owls expressing displeasure at the motion. Harry and Hermione stood within it, genuinely unhurried, and the crowd moved around them the way crowds adjusted when the people standing in them weren't navigating but simply present. Ginny Weasley came through the barrier and spotted them inside 40 seconds. She stopped walking. Something complicated moved across her face. Not surprise. More the expression of someone receiving confirmation of a thing they'd suspected without knowing they suspected it. She looked at Harry's formal red and gold robes, at Hermione's blue and silver, at the Gringotts insignia they both wore, and then she looked at Harry's face in the way she'd been doing since first year, directly, without performance. She gave him a single nod, sharp, deliberate, the kind that communicated both "I see what you've done" and "of course you did." Then she glanced toward the carriages, making some private calculation, and continued walking in that direction. Whether she was going toward Hogwarts or away from it, Harry couldn't tell yet. He'd find out. Ron saw Harry and started across the platform. Then, stopped. Harry's bearing had changed in ways Ron couldn't precisely name, not physically different, but carrying something different. The way a room changed when the furniture was the same, but the light had moved. Ron stood 12 feet away and experienced the particular discomfort of someone whose internal understanding of another person had just been shown to be incomplete. Neville and Luna came off the train together, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had spent August preparing for exactly this moment. They positioned themselves near the transit point at the platform's edge, without drawing attention. Fred and George materialized behind them carrying their own trunks, plus 3 additional cases that rattled with glass and metal, and what was probably charmed paper. Fred made eye contact with Harry. George made eye contact with Hermione. Then they both looked at each other. They repositioned without comment. Then Draco Malfoy descended from the train with the practiced ease of someone who had been watched his whole life and had developed, as a result, an acute ability to assess any environment before entering it. His gaze swept the platform with professional thoroughness and stopped when it found Harry. He didn't sneer. That was the notable thing, the complete absence of the reflex. Instead, he looked at the faint Gringotts insignia at Harry's collar, and something moved through his expression that was not fear, but was the calculation of someone who was very skilled at reading power, who was actively doing so, and who was finding the reading more complex than anticipated. He didn't approach. He filed the information and boarded the carriages without comment. But he did not look away until he had to. The Great Hall on September's first evening held the enchanted ceiling showing the early night sky, candles burning in their hundreds, house tables lined with students who had been on a train all day. The sorting had just finished. First years were settling into their assigned seats with the self-conscious relief of children who had been named. Umbridge was already at the staff table. Her coral pink robes occupied a register of wrongness that went beyond aesthetic. They were the deliberate visual marker of someone who had decided that softness was effective camouflage for its opposite. She sat with the composed satisfaction of a person who believes they have arrived exactly where they belong by right. Dumbledore was rising to speak. The hall's main doors opened. Harry and Hermione walked in. The doors hadn't been pushed, they simply opened, which required attention to notice, and most people's attention was already directed at the 2 figures entering. They covered the length of the hall between the house tables without hurrying, and stopped at the center. The silence that fell wasn't the silence of magic. It was 400 people making the same decision simultaneously, to pay attention. Dumbledore sat back down. Slowly, Umbridge's smile passed through several states. Genuine anticipation, performed pleasantness, something fixed in place by will alone, and arrived somewhere that was neither. Students of Hogwarts. Hermione's voice carried without amplification, reaching every person in the room without distortion. We are not here to take your places at this school. We are here because you deserve a choice no one has offered you. She let that rest. My name is Hermione Jean Granger. I am the magic true heir of Ravenclaw, confirmed by Gringotts' charter verification in early July of this year. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said it, the way you said things that were true. Beside me stands Harry James Potter, confirmed heir of Gryffindor, same verification, same date. We have founded a new school, the Academy of Emrys, Sovereign Territory, registered with the International Confederation of Wizards under primary charter status. Its doors are open. Effective immediately. Harry spoke then. He looked across the full spread of the house tables, not at any single face, but at the entire population of young people who had been sorted into categories and given uniforms, and told the institution would protect them. Hogwarts was built to protect you. The events of last June suggest it is no longer able to do that. The silence of people not breathing. We're not offering a rebellion. We're offering a door. He looked across the tables. You can stay. Nobody will think less of you for it. Or you can walk out of this hall and come to a school where the first lesson is your right to be there. 3 seconds of absolute quiet. Then Neville Longbottom stood up. Just stood. His bag was already packed, had been packed since August, since the bird on his shoulder, since his grandmother's voice saying your mother and father would have been proud. He didn't announce himself, he didn't look around for approval or confirmation. He simply rose to his full height at the Gryffindor table, with the composure of someone who is living inside a decision already made, not arriving at one. Luna rose at the Ravenclaw table with the same unhurried ease she brought to everything, the same ease she'd brought to waltzing a Snargaluff, to packing her belongings 3 weeks prior. Fred and George rose simultaneously from opposite sides of the hall where they'd been sitting with their respective year groups, already reaching for their bags. Then, it cascaded. Not dramatically, not in a wave, but in the organic pattern of people making separate decisions that happened to point the same direction. A second-year Hufflepuff, who had been crying quietly since the September before last. 3 Ravenclaw sixth years, who had been following Hermione's reading list since third year, and had, through that practice, arrived at conclusions she had anticipated. A Muggle-born fifth year from Slytherin who had been told, 11 times in the past year in various formulations, that she did not belong where she was. 83 students rose to their feet in the Great Hall. Umbridge's smile was gone. The architecture of her face without it was a different structure entirely. The composed authority underneath exposed. And beneath that, the particular expression of someone who has just understood that the instrument of control they were preparing to use has significantly fewer subjects than anticipated. Harry didn't look at her face for long. He turned and walked toward the doors, and 83 people followed him into the September night. The Gringotts' sovereign escort was waiting at the ground's edge. 14 figures in charcoal robes, positioned in a formation that communicated logistical precision and something harder to name. The authority of an institution that had been conducting these operations since before the Ministry was a concept. Director Ragnarok stood at the formation's head and inclined toward Harry and Hermione with a formality that was not performance. The Sovereign Transit is prepared. It has been 347 years since the last founding institution transit. A pause that held real weight. Gringotts is pleased to be of service. Thank you, Director. Thank us when you've done it. Dolores Umbridge had followed them. She arrived at the ground's edge with the momentum of someone who had spent 20 years learning that authority. Projected with sufficient force, resolved most complications before they became problems. Behind her, 2 Ministry officials, slightly breathless, recalled from their evenings to manage something that had not appeared on any planning document. Stop. You are in violation of Educational Decree Number. Hermione turned. She reached into her satchel, the leather one she had carried from Privet Drive. Through the leaky cauldron, through Gringotts, through every stage of the past 2 months, and removed a single document. She held it out at arm's length with the patience of someone who had prepared for this moment in late July, and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. Ministry educational decrees operate within the Ministry's domestic jurisdiction. That jurisdiction does not supersede the ICW Primary Charter Act of 1692. She tapped the document's header. This is a certified copy of the Academy of Emra's primary charter registration, filed with the ICW Enforcement Bureau in early July, and confirmed 3 weeks later. The students behind me are enrolled members of a sovereign institution. You have no standing here. Umbridge raised her wand. The spell she attempted, standard impediment, ministry grade, the sort that had ended altercations in 6 different departments she had worked across, materialized at the tip and then stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed. Stopped, at the point in the air where Hogwarts' original ward infrastructure had once extended and no longer did. The ward threshold had been redrawn, and Ministry-registered magic recognized the new boundary even when the witch holding the wand refused to. She tried a second time. Same result. She looked at her wand. Then at Harry. Sovereign ground extends 12 feet beyond the standing student group during active transit, Harry said, in the tone of someone who has fully internalized a document. You're on the wrong side of it. He turned to Ragnarok. Are we ready? Whenever you are, Lord Heir. Hagrid arrived running, the enormous ungainly urgency of a very large man who had made a decision in the last 30 seconds and was committing before the commitment could be examined. He came from the direction of his hut, pink umbrella in one hand, his face carrying the expression of someone who has been holding the wrong version of a thing for too long. He reached the ground's edge and stopped, the 2 Ministry officials between him and the transit point. Harry stepped back through the boundary. Hagrid's eyes were red at the edges. I yed wrong, Harry, not just now, all along. There was things I should have told ye, and things I should have done different. His enormous hands gripped the umbrella. Can I come? Harry walked forward, put his hand on Hagrid's arm, and walked him back through to the transit point. Umbridge said something at high volume. The words dispersed in the night air without finding purchase. The sovereign transit manifested from the ground rather than the air, a cascade of silver-blue light rising through the grass in 3 sequential waves, each one claiming a portion of the assembled students and carrying them through a transition that lasted 90 seconds per wave. Long enough to be witnessed. Long enough to be remembered. Those still inside Hogwarts came to the windows. Ron Weasley stood 40 feet back with his arms folded, jaw set at the angle it went when he was working through something difficult. He had stayed. The choice had been real, and watching the transit light carry people away was doing something complicated to his certainty about it. Not enough to change it, but enough to register. He thought about Neville Longbottom, who had stood first, about what a real decision looked like from the outside versus the inside, about the thought that arrived unbidden and persistent regardless of everything else. What is it like there, at a second-floor window? Draco Malfoy watched with the calculating attention he had applied to Harry all evening. His face was doing the careful work of someone updating a large number of assessments simultaneously, and when the third wave took the remaining students, and the light fell and the grass was simply empty, he stayed at the window for a long time after. The Isle of Avalon received them in 3 waves on a night of extraordinary stars. Dobby was at the beach. Of course he was. The kitchens were lit, the dormitory clusters prepared, the paths between structures illuminated by Hermione's August installation responding to foot traffic, operating exactly as specified, which she noted with the particular satisfaction of a confirmed prediction. Fred stepped onto the dark sand and stood still. George came beside him. They looked at the dome catching the starlight, the library terrace above the tree line, the paths connecting structure to structure across a landscape that had been uninhabited a month ago and was now, unmistakably, a place. "He actually built it," Fred said, very quietly. "We knew he would," George said. "Yeah." A pause that lasted a moment longer than it needed to. "I'm still saying it." Neville stepped 20 feet onto the island and stopped, both feet flat on the ground, not moving. Not because anything was wrong. The island's soil, dense with 15 centuries of accumulated magical energy, a place that had been storing something for a very long time and was finally releasing it into use, was doing something through the soles of his shoes he had never felt before. He had no framework for it yet. He would, within 3 weeks, develop one. Harry and Hermione came through last, the air bond that sealed the transit requiring both of them at the terminus. They stepped onto the beach together. The wards ran their quiet, complete circuit. The hall dome held the stars. The apple trees stood their patient watch. "Everyone's here?" Harry said. Hermione checked her list. "Everyone's here." He looked at the school they had built. She looked at her list. Then she looked up at the school they had built. 85 people had followed them through a door they'd opened in the middle of a great hall with 40 pages of legal documentation and a clear-eyed account of what was true. Tomorrow, the first classes would begin. The dome on the morning of the second day was open to September in the way Hermione had designed it, the island sky visible through a charm layer that rendered the boundary between interior and exterior almost invisible until rain tested it. A brief coastal shower passed through and the hall remained dry, and several students held out their hands toward the dome's edge with the wonder of people encountering magic that was elegant rather than just impressive. Dobby had been planning the inaugural breakfast since July. He had notes, 7 pages of them, organized by what he described in an enthusiastic memo as the emotional frequencies that different foods address in people who have recently made large decisions. The result accomplished something at once simple and uncommon. It made everyone at the tables feel the morning was worth being in. Neville sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the eastern orchards, the trees carrying their impossible fruit through September, indifferent to seasonal logic, and tried to identify what he was feeling. Not nervousness, not excitement, something underneath both. Something to do with the soil he'd felt through his shoes on the beach last night, with the light coming through the windows, with the way the island seemed continuously aware of him at a frequency just below language. His body had apparently decided this was information rather than stimulus, and had stopped bracing against it. Calm, he identified eventually. Not suppressed, not performed. The actual thing. He ate his breakfast. Luna had found the library's third-floor reading terrace before anyone else was awake, cross-legged with a book open to an unrelated page, and a Concordia Argenti perched on her right shoulder. She had named it Centaurus, without needing to consider the name. The way you didn't need to consider something you already knew. 3 second years found her there after breakfast. They had been looking for the library and found the terrace instead, which was better in several ways. Luna was describing the Pleiades from memory while the star map overhead, Hermione's enchantment reactive to individual attention, zoomed toward Taurus and annotated as she spoke. The 3 second years stayed for an hour and left having memorized more astronomy than their combined Hogwarts coursework had covered. The first all-school gathering was at 9. 83 students settled into the hall with the slight uncertainty of people who had arrived somewhere new and were waiting to understand how it worked. Hermione spoke first. The Academy's timetable is not organized by year group. It's organized by aptitude and interest, and it moves at the pace most useful to each individual student. She paused. I recognize this is disorienting if you've spent 4 years moving through identical subjects with your age cohort. How do you know which classes to attend? You tell us what you're drawn to. We discuss it. You attend sessions that match where you actually are, not where the calendar says you should be. If something isn't working, we adjust. The schedule is a tool, not a rule. Another pause. At Hogwarts, the system tells you who you are. Here, you tell us. A third-year Hufflepuff in the second row raised her hand. What if we don't know what we're drawn to? Then that, Hermione said, without hesitation, is your first project. Finding out. Harry's first primal casting session had 18 students, none of whom had ever attempted controlled magic without a wand. He opened by asking them to put their wands away. Several looked panicked in the way of people who had been holding a wand since they were 11, and had developed over 4 years, a reliance they hadn't noticed until the leaning stopped. I know, Harry said. Hold that feeling, the discomfort of not having it. That's actually where we start. He looked at them. I've been doing wandless magic accidentally since I was 2. What that means is I know what the natural instinct looks like, and I know what blocks it. What blocks it is almost always the assumption that you need something external to shape what your magic does. He held up his right palm. Your wand shapes your magic because you've trained yourself to believe it does. We're not here to break that. Your wand is still valid, still useful. We're here to show you there's another layer underneath. He lit a candle across the room with his open palm. Not dramatically. The flame arrived with the naturalness of something that had been waiting for permission. Questions before we begin? A 6th-year girl said, "What do we do if we can't feel anything?" "You tell me," Harry said. Then we figure out what's in the way. What Harry didn't share with the group, but what Hermione knew because she had been in the sessions when it happened, was the week in late October when she finally broke through. Week 7 of primal casting, 11th consecutive attempt. Open palm, candle across the room, nothing. Harry had watched her narrate her own failure with the clinical accuracy of someone who could describe exactly why a bridge was collapsing while standing on it. He'd tried 3 different approaches across 4 sessions. None of them worked, because none of them addressed the real problem, which was that Hermione Granger's relationship with her own magic had been entirely mediated by the external validation of examiners and curricula for 5 years. And something in that mediation had built a wall between knowing and doing. On the 7th attempt in week 8, he didn't give her any instructions at all. He told her to think about Dobby. She looked at him. Dobby? Specifically, whether he's genuinely content or performing contentment, because the bonding structure defaults to that. Whether being a free elf here is actually different from what came before, or whether we've just changed the name of the arrangement. She opened her mouth, closed it. He watched something shift in her expression, not calculation, something underneath calculation, something she was not accustomed to letting operate in front of other people. The candle lit, not dramatically. A clean, precise flame, 4 seconds, controlled and specific, produced by an open palm and the thing underneath the narration that turned out to be the most powerful part of her. She didn't cry. She pressed her free hand flat against her thigh, with a firmness that suggested everything else was compensating for something. And Harry said again very quietly, and she said again. And the flame came back, and this time her hand was still. Hermione's living law sessions ran 20 minutes longer than planned because the discussions kept producing questions more interesting than the answers she'd prepared. She taught from principle outward. The legal architecture of the wizarding world was not a ministry construction. It was a layered accretion of agreements and covenants written by people across 1,000 years who had collectively understood something the current ministry had forgotten, that law derived its authority from the consent of the governed, not from the force of the governing. When Neville asked what the most foundational principle of the Magica Successio was, she paused. Not the theatrical pause of someone who knows the answer already, the genuine article, the pause of someone for whom the question had reached a layer she found worth considering. That the obligation runs from the institution to the student, she said. Not the other way. The school serves you. You don't serve the school. She looked at the 12 faces absorbing this. I know that sounds obvious. It isn't. Most of what's wrong with how institutions treat people comes from inverting that relationship, from behaving as though students exist to perpetuate the school rather than the school existing to develop them. A fifth-year muggle born from Ravenclaw said, "I've been at Hogwarts for 4 years, and no one has ever said that to me." "No," Hermione said. "I don't think they have." 6 weeks into term, the Eastern Hedge sang. Not loudly, at a frequency below conversation, perceptible only through the chest, the vibration of something living that had found its optimal state. Hermione detected it through a monitoring instrument she'd calibrated in late September precisely for this purpose. She stood at the eastern approach and measured the hedge's magical density output against her projections, and found it running approximately 40% above what she had considered theoretically achievable. Neville was 16 feet away with both palms flat on the soil, not moving. She had learned over 6 weeks not to interrupt this state. It was not meditation, it was what she'd come to think of as active listening, a sustained receptive engagement with the island's information. Whatever Neville received through the ground was a kind of data she could not directly access, and her scientific instinct was clear. When you cannot access a source, study the output. The hedge had grown 9 years' worth in 9 hours. She wrote this in her notebook in the precise handwriting she reserved for findings she expected to be cited later. Neville opened his eyes and looked at the hedge, then at her. It was unhappy with the planting arrangement. There's a subsurface water channel 6 feet down that the layout wasn't accounting for. I asked if it wanted to rearrange. A pause. It did. Hermione underlined her note and added 2 more below it. You asked it. It has preferences, Neville said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious that won't be obvious to the listener. I think most living things have preferences nobody asks about. Luna's breakthrough arrived differently, not a development of something new, but a naming of something she had always possessed. The moment came during a ward diagnostic Harry was running on the eastern perimeter. Luna appeared beside him with her measuring instrument, and began producing readings that were, by any conventional standard, impossible. Not wrong, impossible. The instrument was returning information about frequency registers that standard diagnostic charms didn't access. Walk me through what you see when you look at the ward, Harry said. She described it for 4 minutes without stopping, in language that was specific and internally consistent, and not at all what anyone else would have described seeing. The ward's magical composition, its frequency distribution, the patterns in its adaptive response layer, she described all of it as direct perception, the way you'd describe the color of a wall. Hermione read the transcript of this conversation 6 times over 2 days, then brought Harry a 12-page analysis with the expression she wore when she had found something important and was still catching up to its implications. She perceives magical frequency registers that conventional training simply doesn't activate. The creatures she describes, the Nargles, the Rackspurts, they're entities operating in those registers. She's been perceiving them her entire life because she processes magical information differently. It isn't imagination. She set the analysis down. It has never been imagination. Harry said. I know. Hermione said. You knew? Not exactly. But she's never been wrong about anything that mattered. Hermione looked at her analysis. She added a paragraph to it and filed it under Foundational Discoveries Year 1, a folder she had not anticipated needing to create quite this early in the term. Fred and George had produced 4 things the Academy formally certified as novel contributions to magical theory by December, more than most graduated wizards produced in a lifetime. The sympathetic paper messaging system alone had practical applications in 7 areas Hermione identified immediately. She told them so with the directness she reserved for work she considered genuinely important, unqualified, followed by a specific list of suggested refinements. The twins received this with the expression of people who had spent 4 years at Hogwarts being told their work was clever but frivolous, encountering for the first time an environment that treated the same work as valuable and worth developing. "She actually wants us to make it better," Fred said. "I know," George said. "Not instead of serious work, as the serious thing. I know." Fred went quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that was allowed." The end of autumn review, not examinations, convened one December afternoon in the hall. Every student presented what they had built or understood or discovered. Demonstrations ran at the hall's edges. Conversations overlapped, the noise considerable and entirely intentional. A second-year Muggle-born who had arrived in September unable to hold a Lumos charm steady for 3 seconds, demonstrated a wandless illumination she had developed by the 8th week of primal casting. Not a Lumos variant, but something new. A light that adjusted its warmth and intensity in response to the emotional states of the people around it. She couldn't fully explain how she had built it. Harry was fairly certain she hadn't built it so much as discovered it, which was a distinction worth making. The 5th-year Slytherin Muggle-born who had arrived with 11 documented incidents of being told she didn't belong where she was, presented a 15-page independent study on historical precedent for Muggle-born magical lineages. Co-authored with a pureblood 4th-year from Hufflepuff, who had become her research partner in October. Neither had been asked to produce this. They had followed a question. Neville's preliminary framework for terramantic communication, a relationship model rather than a spell system, a structured approach to exchanging information with living things. Occupied a section of the hall for 40 minutes. He spoke without notes. 3 students asked questions he hadn't anticipated, and his answers to each were better than his prepared content. Because Neville Longbottom, in an environment that treated his instincts as information rather than eccentricity, was a fundamentally different person from the one who had arrived at Hogwarts at 11, believing himself to be bad at magic. Luna's 3-dimensional frequency mapping of the island's complete magical composition rendered itself over a 6-foot section of the hall in luminous air, and held several students and Hermione in silence, for a period that she later described in her notes as approximately 4 minutes, during which no one spoke because the thing being looked at was more interesting than anything available to say about it. Harry stood at the back and watched all of it. He thought about what this had been supposed to feel like. The promise Hogwarts had made, a place where magic was taught to people who needed it. He wasn't sad about the gap between the promise and the delivery. He was past sad. He was in the stage where the thing existed, and he was watching it exist, and it was making noise. And the noise was the sound of people who were not afraid of being wrong. That same evening at Hogwarts, Ron Weasley sat in defense against the dark arts, while Umbridge explained, in her register of performed warmth over structural coldness, that the course would be theory only. No practical casting. Ministry-approved content only. Any student expressing disagreement should be aware that Educational Decree No. 24 prohibited unapproved student organizations. She smiled. The class was silent. Ron looked at the textbook. He looked at the window. He thought about the transit light and the 83 people who had walked into it. He thought about Neville Longbottom, who had stood first without checking whether anyone else would follow. He thought about what real decisions looked like, not the performance of them, but the actual thing, and how you could watch someone else make one for 4 years and still not entirely recognize it when you were in the middle of your own. He didn't change his decision, but the thought arrived anyway. What is it like there? A ministry educational decree arrived by owl on a Tuesday in autumn, deposited simultaneously at Gringotts Bank, the ICW's London office, and the Academy's mailroom, where a Concordia Argenti received it from the ministry owl, with the composed neutrality of a creature that had no opinions about correspondence, but firm opinions about the quality of paper it was asked to carry. Hermione read it at breakfast. 4 paragraphs. The Academy declared an unregistered institution of uncertain orientation operating outside the legitimate framework of British Wizarding Educational Authority. Gringotts accounts held by the founders were to be frozen. 6 previous educational decrees cited as precedent. And the final paragraph, which told Harry everything about Fudge's current state of mind, demanded that all enrolled students return to Hogwarts within 14 days or face formal truancy charges. He thinks the accounts are the leverage, Harry said. The accounts are the only lever he knows how to pull. She set the decree down with the care of someone placing an object she intends to use later. He doesn't have enough information about what we're operating under to know that pulling it is a mistake. When does he find out? She was already writing. 17 minutes after I file. The response reached the ministry via Gringotts courier, the one channel the ministry could not intercept without committing institutional suicide. Hermione had spent 3 weeks on the structure of the argument. The argument itself took 4 days. Structure was always the harder problem. 3 sequential steps. First, the Academy operated under ICW primary charter status, registered and confirmed in early July. ICE primary charter institutions were established by treaty between the ICW and the British Ministry, a treaty ratified in 1692 that superseded domestic decrees. Fudge had attempted to decree against something his own predecessor had agreed was outside the decree system. This was not a legal position. It was a category error dressed in official language. Second, the attempted account freeze constituted lineage theft under Section 17 of the Gringotts Sovereignty Protocols. The penalty was not graduated by intent. It was absolute. Formal censure, full reparations, and revocation of the ministry's preferential treaty terms with Gringotts, replacing them with standard commercial rates. A clause sitting dormant since 1752, never invoked because no ministry had previously been quite this improvident. Third, characterizing the Academy as an institution of uncertain orientation triggered mandatory ICW audit provisions under the International Convention on Magical Education. The audit would find nothing of concern. The ministry would face a formal malicious characterization penalty. The final paragraph was not legal argument. One sentence: the Ministry of Magic is invited to reflect on the distinction between governing and controlling, as the conflation of these two activities is the document's foundational error. The ICAB tribunal convened 6 days later in Geneva. The British ministry's challenge was presented competently and dismissed in 40 minutes. 3 sentences: the Academy's charter confirmed, the ICW's jurisdiction confirmed, and a recommendation that the British ministry consult the 1692 treaty text before initiating future proceedings. The Brazilian delegates' response was, according to 3 separate witnesses, laughter. This was neither confirmed nor denied in any official capacity, but was widely understood to be accurate. The intelligence network had been running since October. 3 sources, each providing what the others couldn't. First, Dobby's network, his own initiative, mentioned to Hermione in mid-October in the matter-of-fact tone he reserved for things he considered obvious. He had been in contact with free elves and sympathetic bonded elves across Britain who moved through locations human wizards guarded carefully against human entry, and who had been willing, once asked, to share what they observed. 17 active contributors by November. Dobby coordinated everything from the island's kitchen during what he described as the hours between the dinner service and the morning preparation, which is precisely when a sensible elf thinks about other things. Second, the Weasley messaging system. Fred and George's sympathetic paper link technology allowed communication between linked documents at distances Owl Post couldn't match. Undetected by ministry monitoring charms, it also possessed, as a byproduct of how sympathetic resonance worked, a passive intercept capacity for any document sharing even partial material composition with a linked paper. Several Death Eater communications were written on parchment from a single supplier. Fred had identified this in November. George built the intercept mechanism in 4 days. Third, Luna. Her frequency mapping translated to any magical environment. She could read the residual signature of recent magical activity in a location with a precision that no conventional diagnostic charm achieved. Places where magic feels wrong was how she had first described it. Under operational conditions, the accuracy was remarkable. Then, there was a 4th source. One that arrived without announcement and without being asked. A Concordia Argenti found its way to the Academy's mailroom on a Tuesday evening in late November carrying a plain envelope sealed in gray wax with no sigil and no return address. The bird was not one of their 34, smaller, its feathers tarnished at the edges, as though it had been kept somewhere that didn't suit it. Inside, one sheet of paper. The handwriting was careful, almost academic, as if the writer had been taught penmanship by someone who cared about it. You should know that McNair is scheduled to move 3 prisoners from the Wiltshire safe house this Friday. There are more safe houses than your network has found. I am not offering anything else. Don't try to find me. Harry showed it to Hermione. She looked at the handwriting for a long time. Draco, she said. Harry had thought so too. He hadn't wanted to say it first. What do we do with it? We verify it. If it's accurate, we use it. We don't respond. She looked up. He's not asking for anything. Don't make him regret sending it. It was accurate. 2 ICW enforcement officers were at the Wiltshire safe house that Friday and recovered all 3 prisoners. 3 more unsigned letters arrived over the following 6 weeks. Each one accurate, each one carefully limited, each one making absolutely clear that the writer was not defecting, was not asking for anything, and was not interested in being found. Harry read each one and placed it in a folder and didn't discuss it at the full faculty briefings. Hermione knew about the folder. They didn't discuss what it meant that Draco Malfoy was, by whatever private calculation, choosing to supply information to the people his father had tried to destroy. There would be time for that later. Operation Marauder's map ran for 4 weeks across the late winter. The name was Sirius's suggestion, a quiet honor paid to something lost by connecting it to something being built. Neither Harry nor Lupin objected. The structure was consistent. Dobby's network provided primary location intelligence, the messaging intercept provided timing confirmation, and Luna's frequency assessment provided the final pre-entry diagnostic. Sirius and Lupin led operational teams assembled from the Sovereign Guard and 2 vetted senior faculty members. Every action followed identical documentation, site coordinates, time of entry, infrastructure inventoried and dismantled, captives identified and freed, location sealed, logs filed with Gringotts Neutral Archive and the ICW Enforcement Bureau simultaneously after each operation, creating an unalterable record that preceded any ministry counterclaim by hours. No Death Eater was killed. Several were bound and delivered, with complete documentation, directly to the ICW Enforcement Bureau. The receiving officer, on the 4th delivery, asked how many more they were expecting. On the 3rd facility raid, Harry rounded a corner in the back corridor and found Draco. Not in Death Eater robes, not with a wand raised. Standing in the corridor with the expression of someone who had made a calculation 3 hours ago and was now present at its consequences. Behind him, a door sat open onto an empty room. The prisoners had gone in the direction of the exit. Neither of them spoke. Harry looked at him for a long moment, at the careful blankness of his face, the thing underneath it that was not quite fear and not quite anything else available in the standard vocabulary. Then he looked at the open door and the empty corridor beyond it. He stepped to the left. Draco walked past him without a word. His footsteps were quiet on the stone. Harry stood in the corridor and listened to them until they were gone, then turned and continued the sweep. He did not include this in the operational report. Hermione did not ask why. Hermione consulted her notebook. 3 facilities remaining in the current phase. Possibly 5 if the Northern assessment is confirmed. The officer said, "We're going to need a larger intake facility." Hermione made a note. Dobby located Peter Pettigrew on a gray morning in the 3rd week of March. He delivered the information at breakfast with the understatement he reserved for significant news. Pettigrew had been relocated to a safe house on Orkney 5 days prior, serving as Voldemort's personal courier between locations. The silver hand, forged in the graveyard, unmistakable, was confirmed by 3 separate elf observers. He was traveling under a poorly maintained disillusionment charm that elf perception cut through without effort. Sirius was not at breakfast. He was in the training space. Harry went to find him. He said it directly, the only appropriate way. Dobby found Pettigrew. He's at an Orkney safe house. We have a window. Sirius set down the practice staff with the careful deliberateness of someone managing their response rather than suppressing it. He was quiet for 10 seconds. "Who's with me? Lupin wants to be there." Something moved across Sirius's face. "I don't want him to have to." "He told me to tell you he's going," Harry said. He didn't phrase it as a request. Another silence. "Right." He picked up the practice staff. "Set it down again." "When?" "Today, 3 ICW enforcement officers are being pre-positioned. Hermione's arranged 2 Wizengamot witnesses who will be present as neutral parties." He paused. "She's thorough. She's extraordinary," Sirius said, without any indication he considered this anything other than fact. "In the most useful way possible." The Orkney safe house was a stone structure visible from the sea, warded against ministry detection, and entirely unprepared for what arrived instead. 4 ICW enforcement officers materialized in the early afternoon. 2 Wizengamot members, arranged as neutral witnesses, were positioned at the perimeter. Sirius and Lupin came in from the north, moving through the approach with the silence of people who had spent 3 weeks developing exactly this kind of competence. The door opened. The main room held a table, a chair pushed back at an angle suggesting recent and rapid departure, and a cold cup of something. The silver hand had left 3 distinct impressions in the surface of the table where it had rested. A coat hung on a hook by the door, still warm. Gone, the enforcement officers swept the remaining rooms with professional efficiency. Lupin stood at the center of the main room and did not move. Sirius was at the window, looking at the Orkney coastline, at the gray water and the gray sky, and the absolute absence of anything he had come here for. One of the witnesses, from the perimeter, appeared in the doorway. He looked at the room. He looked at Sirius. He withdrew without speaking. Sirius sat down on the low wall outside when they sealed the building. He put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for considerably longer than 30 seconds. Lupin sat beside him. The wind came off the water. Neither of them spoke. Eventually Sirius said, "He knew we were coming." "Yes," someone told him. Yes, the sea moved. The clouds moved. Nothing resolved. That evening, the western cliff, Sirius stood alone at the Academy's edge. The island was warm at his back and entirely insufficient. He was 50 years old and had spent the afternoon in an empty room that smelled like the man who had destroyed his life, and he had nothing to show for it except a cold cup and a coat that was not evidence of anything. He looked at the sea for a long time. He was still looking at it when the first stars appeared, and they did not help, and he stayed anyway. The assault came in the early hours of Valentine's Day. The Academy's interior alarm did not sound like an alarm. Hermione had designed it as a harmonic, a low resonance that moved through the island's stone at a frequency perceptible only to those who had spent enough time on Avalon for their bodies to attune to its baseline. Not a sound you heard. A sound you felt in the sternum, in the bones, in the way a ship's crew registered an engine change before consciously identifying what had shifted. Both of them were awake at 17 minutes to 3. They met in the hall before either had consciously decided to go there. Sirius and Lupin were already at the central table, the ward monitoring display active in the air above it. A holographic rendering of the island's full perimeter and the 3 nautical miles sovereign maritime zone, magical signatures appearing as colored points of light moving through the dark water. 15 signatures. 3 approach vectors. Harry's assessment took 30 seconds. Lucius Malfoy, northwestern approach. Bellatrix Lestrange, due north. She's already attempted 1 breach. He studied the display. This is a capture operation. He doesn't have the resources for institutional destruction tonight. Standard plan? Lupin said. Standard plan. Sirius reached for Fred and George's ward intensifier prototype, a handheld device built from their sympathetic enchanting protocols, compact and considerably more elegant than its early experimental predecessors. He turned it over with the appreciation of someone assessing an unfamiliar tool and finding it well made. Fred said, from the doorway, in matching dressing gown with George beside him, "Modified version." "There's a light show option." Sirius looked at them both. His expression moved through several things and arrived at a smile that was complete, unperformed. The kind that belonged to a man who had spent too long in places that offered nothing worth smiling at, and was somewhere entirely different now. "Activate it," he said. The wards had been registering the approach since the first perimeter crossing, 12 minutes before the hall alarm. 7 nautical miles of sovereign maritime boundary gave the intelligence layer exactly the time Hermione had calculated. Threat classification, signature identification, and preparation of active response, all without requiring direction from either air or any human authority. The Concordia Argenti rose first, all 34. Lifting simultaneously from the northern forest into formation that traced a 7-pointed pattern Hermione would later identify from Ravenclaw's bestiary notes as the classical ward protection configuration, apparently preserved in the bird's collective memory across a millennium of dormancy. No one had taught them this. They simply knew. The apple trees on the shoreline leaned toward the water, not blown by any wind, reaching, deliberate. The cliff face shifted incrementally, certain surfaces repositioning in ways that altered the approach geometry from the sea. 3 assault vectors that had been viable became impractical. One that had appeared viable became impossible. The ward light, normally invisible, appeared at the sovereign boundary, luminous silver, rising from the surface of the dark February sea to a height the approaching boats, low, enchanted against standard detection, prepared for almost everything, could see from a significant distance. In the northernmost boat, Bellatrix Lestrange raised her wand and directed a curse at the silver boundary with the accuracy of extensive practice. The ward received it, did not deflect it, did not dissipate it, absorbed it and converted the energy into additional structural reinforcement, every hostile magic directed at the boundary becoming load-bearing material. The wall was thicker for the attack. The curse returned along its precise trajectory, augmented by the absorbed force. Bellatrix dodged. Her boat did not. Harry took the cliff's edge. Below him and to his left, Sirius led the Sovereign Guard down the cliff path. 6 students who had completed the full war magic curriculum and who moved through this with the organized calm of people who had learned, through repetition under controlled conditions, that panic was a response to insufficient preparation. Lupin moved with the economy of someone who had long since made peace with his own nature and found that understanding applicable to other difficult situations. The ward intensifier activated its light show component. What this produced at the cliff's edge was a secondary luminous display, amber gold, moving in patterns that were simultaneously remarkable and practically excellent for ward layer targeting. The display pulsed in time with the ward's own response rhythm, which Hermione had not requested but acknowledged, upon later review, was a genuine functional improvement. Fred's contribution to the design. George had added the frequency modulation. Below, on the water, the Death Eater formation encountered problems it had not anticipated. Sirius reached the base of the cliff path and moved along the rocky shoreline with Lupin 10 paces to his left, the 2 of them operating in the coordinated silence of a partnership that predated the Ministry, predated Azkaban, predated almost everything that had happened to either of them in the intervening years. Sirius fired the ward intensifier at the boundary's outer edge, and the amber gold display pulsed, layering over the silver in a way that confused the approaching boat's alignment charms. They had been calibrated for a single ward source, and were now attempting to triangulate against 2 distinct magical signatures operating in complementary frequencies. It was George's idea, Sirius would later acknowledge. The frequency modulation was entirely George's idea. The Sovereign Guard students spread across the cliff base in the formation Harry had drilled them on for 3 weeks, each pair covering overlapping fields without redundancy. A 5th year from Hufflepuff maintained the secondary ward relay on the right flank, with the focused composure of someone who had been terrified during the first 2 weeks of war magic training and had arrived, somewhere in the 3rd week, at the other side of that terror. A Ravenclaw 6th year held the left. Between them, the ward's exposed coastal edge was managed without gaps. Lucius Malfoy's boat reached the ward boundary. He raised his wand. His curse was absorbed and returned. He was skilled enough to deflect the return and tried again with a different approach. The second approach was absorbed and returned at greater force than the first. The third, 3 other Death Eaters casting simultaneously. The ward brightened. Visibly, observably, the silver light deepened with each additional input, more present, more solid, with every magical attack directed against it. Malfoy looked at the boundary. He had read intelligence reports about a school defended by two 15-year-olds. He was looking at something built by two 15-year-olds who had understood something about defensive architecture that his own extensive experience had not prepared him to anticipate. A ward structure powered by air-bond magic and supplemented by hostile input was not a fixed defense. It was a learning system. Every attack made it more specifically resistant to that attack. He looked at the cliff's edge. Harry was there. Visible at the boundary's inner edge, watching, Malfoy directed a killing curse at him. The boundary caught it. The silver deepened again. The absorbed energy distributed through the matrix. Harry held Malfoy's gaze for a long moment without moving. Then he looked back at the tactical display, checking the formation's response. Systematic, professional, managing a situation. Malfoy signaled retreat. The boats withdrew in the manner of people who had arrived confident and were departing with something revised in their understanding of the world. Bellatrix's boat, still taking on water from the returned curse, was being towed by the others. The amber gold display faded. The silver at the ward boundary settled back toward its ordinary invisibility, somewhat brighter than it had been before the assault, and measurably more specific in its threat recognition. The Concordia Argenti returned to the northern forest in silence, 34 silver shapes dissolving back into the trees. Sirius stood at the cliff's base and watched the boats become small in the distance. Lupin came to stand beside him, saying nothing. After a moment, Sirius said, "Right. That's what that feels like." Lupin said, "Yes." They were quiet for a while, watching the dark water. Harry went to Hannah first. She was sitting against the cliff base with her right hand in her lap, and the Ravenclaw's sixth year crouching beside her, saying something quiet and steady. Harry sat down on the rocks. He didn't have anything to say that was adequate, and he didn't try to find it. He just sat there until Hermione arrived with the diagnostic kit and began running the assessment with the expression she wore when results meant something she wasn't ready to say aloud yet. "Good wards," Sirius said. "Very good wards. Hermione's work. And Harry's. And yours, and mine, and 6 students who didn't flinch." Lupin paused. "And Fred and George's, to be precise about it." Sirius made a sound that was something between acknowledgement and laughter. Fred and George's light show saved the left flank's alignment by about 90 seconds. "I noticed. Don't tell them. They'll never stop talking about it. I was going to put it in my report." Sirius turned to look at him. "You were not. I am absolutely putting it in my report." They began the walk back up the cliff path in the early morning, and the island's wards ran their circuit behind them, improved by what had been thrown against them, learning as they had been designed to learn, holding as they had been built to hold. In the after silence, Hermione ran diagnostics. She sat at the hall table with the monitoring display and her notebook, examining how the test had run against her design specifications. Most things were within projected parameters. One thing was not. She looked at the ward matrix display for a long time. There was a signature in the core that had not been present in her original installation. Not foreign. The opposite. So indigenous to the ward that it appeared to have been there from the beginning, invisible until the assault had stressed the matrix enough to make it legible. A resonant pairing running at the ward's deepest layer. Frequency matched to both of them simultaneously. Warm and unwavering. She cross-referenced it against pre-ministry texts in Ravenclaw's personal library. The phenomenon had been documented, if rarely, a convergence of 2 magical cores that had worked in proximity long enough, and with sufficient mutual trust, to begin operating as a unified system without conscious direction. Not a spell. Not a charm. Something that had simply developed. The way certain things developed when the conditions were right and neither person involved was paying attention to anything except the work. Harry found her there in the early morning. She showed him the display. She explained what the signature was in the organized way she explained things that were precise and real. "Our magic is bonded," he said. "The literature on this is limited, but technically and in practice, yes," she kept her eyes on the display. "The most powerful ward substrate in documented history, by a significant margin." Silence. The display pulsed between them, steady. "Is that," he started. "Good?" Structurally, unambiguously, yes. A pause. Personally speaking, yeah, he said. Yes, she said. They looked at the display together. The paired signature moved in a rhythm that didn't belong to either of them individually but to what they were together. Something that had apparently always been there, doing what it did, long before anyone looked. Dawn came over the water. The wards held. Hermione produced the legal response by 6 a.m. and presented it at the faculty breakfast, with the clarity of someone who had spent the night working, rather than sleeping. The assault constitutes an act of warfare against an ICW primary charter institution, conducted by agents of what ICW Law 77 classifies as a sovereign hostile body. We are legally entitled to conduct defensive operations against that body's infrastructure in protection of our enrolled population. She looked at the assembled faces. This is not vigilantism. Vigilantism operates outside legal authority. What I'm describing operates within Article 31 of the ICW's institutional self-defense provisions, certified as applicable to our situation as of 6 this morning. Sirius said, operational parameters? Death Eater infrastructure only. No civilian engagement. No lethal force except direct self-defense. Full documentation for ICW post hoc review. A pause. We do not inform the Order of the Phoenix. Harry said, why not? Because Dumbledore will redirect the operations through his own command structure, and his command structure makes decisions based on information management I don't yet trust to serve our specific interests. She met his eyes directly. I'm not ready to have that argument yet. We'll have it eventually. Not now. Sirius looked at Lupin. Lupin looked at Sirius. Between them passed the wordless communication of two people who had been friends for 30 years. Sirius said, right, what do we have on their locations? Hermione opened her second folder. The malicious characterization penalty was assessed in January, following the ICW audit's conclusion. The reparations figure was calculated by Gringotts Legal Division using their standard lineage theft methodology, actual financial harm, plus statutory damages, plus the ministry's share of the audit costs its false characterization had necessitated. Hermione performed the calculation, submitted it with her working to the Daily Prophet's financial correspondent, and the paper ran it on page 3, Ministry accidentally funds Academy it sought to close. Neville brought the paper to Hermione in the library, where she had been working since early morning on a new section of Ravenclaw's translation. She read it. Set the paper down with the care of someone placing something they have finished using. Then she pulled her translation project toward her, found her place on the page, picked up her quill and kept working. Harry found her an hour later, tea gone cold at her elbow, 3 pages further along. 53% of the endowment, she said, without looking up. Once the audit reimbursement processes. He sat beside her and looked at what she was translating. Ravenclaw's fragment, section 4, in a second layer of the original script, a notation style that appeared only in the personal copies, never the institutional documents. Hermione had found it in January. She had been reading it slowly. She wrote it differently when she was writing for herself, Harry said. Yes. She turned a page. The institutional documents were architectural. These are almost confessional. She writes about her fear of what the school system she was building would become, her concern that sorting students into categories would eventually be used to divide them rather than understand them, her hope that someone would be compelled, eventually, to correct it. She paused, quill still. She didn't write this for posterity in the general sense. She wrote it for whoever the crucible would eventually find. He stayed quiet. She wrote it for me, Hermione said, not with drama, simply as a fact that she was still settling into, the way you settled into facts that were too large to carry all at once. He stayed and read alongside her as the morning became afternoon, and the tea went entirely cold, and the library held its quiet around them both. In February, Ron was standing in a corridor outside the second-floor classrooms when a prefect he vaguely knew escorted a second-year girl he didn't toward Umbridge's office. The girl was small and carrying her bag in both arms against her chest the way people carried things when they needed something to hold. Ron stood 12 feet away with his own bag over one shoulder. He knew what happened in that office. He had known since October. He didn't move. The corridor emptied. He was still standing there. Then he walked to dinner. The collapse of the Umbridge administration ran on a concurrent timeline. The ICW's formal investigation into ministry educational practices, running since November, with the persistence of a body that understood it had no deadline pressure, published its findings in early June, 18 pages, measured and thorough, addressing the detention records, the blood quills, the systematic suppression of defensive magical education, the deployment of institutional machinery specifically designed to punish dissent. Published simultaneously in the ICW Educational Bulletin and the Daily Prophet, whose new editor had spent 3 months repositioning the paper toward the radical practice of reporting what was verifiably true. Umbridge did not resign on the day of publication. She issued a counter-statement, held press positions, and deployed every tool that had reliably shielded ministry officials from accountability for 30 years. 8 days later, she resigned. The investigation then expanded to include her broader ministry conduct, a scope expansion triggered by documentation from Harry and Hermione's legal proceedings the previous year. She was arrested 10 days after her resignation, in the ministry's main atrium, during peak working hours, in front of what witnesses estimated at 63 people. The sounds she made, several of those witnesses later reported, were not any specific words. They were in a register below language, the protest of someone who had never once in their professional life been on the receiving end of the system they administered. Fudge's vote of no confidence was called the following week. He announced his resignation the morning it was scheduled, citing health considerations, a phrase that everyone who had observed him over the preceding 10 months understood to be a description of a different condition entirely. The letter to Dumbledore was, after 11 drafts, 2 sentences. Hermione had recognized at version 7 that everything beyond 2 sentences was either justification or performance. The letter needed to open a door, not argue for its existence. We would like to meet, somewhere neutral, at your choosing. There are things we should discuss that we believe we are now at a point to resolve. HP. And HJG. Dumbledore arrived at the Leaky Cauldron's back booth on a Thursday morning in early June. The same booth. This was deliberate. Hermione had specified it because beginnings mattered, and she wanted Dumbledore to sit down in this particular space and understand, without it being stated, that the people across from him had been here almost a year ago with 40 pages of documentation and a Gringotts appointment, and had done exactly what they said they would. He looked older, not dramatically, but with the weight of a man who had spent 10 months watching something happen that he hadn't planned for, assessing it through a framework built over decades, and finding the framework repeatedly insufficient for what it was being asked to describe. He looked at Harry and Hermione across the table. Hermione was 16. Harry would turn 16 at the end of July. They looked like young people who had spent 10 months building and defending and litigating a sovereign magical institution, because that was precisely what they were. Dumbledore said, "I owe you an apology. Several, in fact." Harry waited. "I kept information you had the right to hold. I made choices on your behalf without your knowledge or consent, built on an assumption I never sufficiently examined, that protecting you and preparing you were 2 separate projects, and that the first took precedence. I now understand they were the same project. My execution of the first prevented the second. I am sorry for that." The apology was real. Harry recognized the genuine article because he had received many performances of it over the years, and knew the difference in texture. This was not performance. "I know you weren't trying to harm me," Harry said. "I've had 10 months to think about it clearly. What you did was manage me. You decided what I needed to know based on what you needed me to do. And you were so accustomed to managing situations from above that it didn't register I was a person inside the situation rather than a piece of it." Dumbledore received this without deflection. Hermione opened the folder she had brought, organized, indexed, and turned to the page she had been sitting with for 6 weeks. "What we need to discuss is not the past. The past is fully documented." She set Ravenclaw's translated fragment on the table, pointed to the specific passage, watched Dumbledore's face. The slight widening of his eyes was not surprise at the content. It was the recognition of content he had known, encountered reflected from an entirely unexpected direction. "You know about the Horcruxes. Hermione said. A silence that lasted long enough to confirm what she had already determined. Yes, said Dumbledore. She said, then tell us everything. He told them everything. 2 hours, cold tea, Harry asking questions at points where information connected to things he had witnessed directly. Hermione wrote without stopping. When Dumbledore finished, she reviewed her notes for 4 minutes in silence. Then she said, the scar. Yes, Dumbledore said. Harry said, tell me directly. Dumbledore looked at him with the expression of a man who had been carrying a specific knowledge for years, and had made, in each successive year, the same decision about whether to share it. He could see now the accumulated weight of that consistency. He told Harry directly. What followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of someone receiving information and integrating it in real time, locating it within everything else they knew, determining how it changed the shape of the problem. Harry said, how certain are you? Sufficiently. Harry looked at Hermione. She was already writing. He said, we're going to need access to your full research on this. Dumbledore said, you'll have it. They returned to Hogwarts together, one final time. Walking through the castle, Harry, Hermione, Dumbledore, in the quiet of an institution carrying loss, without knowing its full shape. Certain enchantments ran at reduced capacity, perceptible to anyone who had spent time in a building built from the full set of founder contributions, and was walking through one now operating on half its original infrastructure. McGonagall met them in the Great Hall. Flitwick, Sprout, faculty who had spent the year navigating a school under political siege with the professionalism of people who understood that the work continued, regardless of who was trying to prevent it. Hermione set the proposal on the table. Not an absorption, not a closure. A partnership of institutions, ICW-mediated, legally structured. The two schools operating in parallel with curriculum exchanges and shared innovations and, critically, the partial restoration of the magical infrastructure withdrawn the previous July. She was precise about this distinction. We're not returning the secession. The secession stands as legal precedent. What we're offering is a gift. A partial sharing of ancestral essence from one sovereign institution to a partner institution, freely given, not compelled. The difference matters. Hogwarts didn't earn back what was taken. We're choosing to share it because winning creates the freedom to be generous. McGonagall said, what do you need from us in return? Implementation of curriculum exchanges. Full transparency with the ICW audit process. And formal acknowledgement, in the school's institutional record, that the Magica Successio occurred and was legally valid. Hermione paused. We're not asking for an apology. We're asking for accuracy. Dumbledore shook Harry's hand. Then, Hermione's. The greater good was never meant to mean this, he said. Something in his expression shifted, not regret exactly, but something forward-facing. The look of someone who has been wrong and decided the correct response is to be less wrong going forward. Watching what you've built this year has given me cause to reconsider what I thought it meant. He looked at both of them. Carry on. The lights in Hogwarts Castle were fully on in every window when they left, not visibly different from any other evening at this distance. But different in a way that was not visible and was nonetheless real. Something returned to the stones, partial but genuine, the quiet reinstatement of what had been withdrawn. Not everything, some of what had left in July belonged to the island now, permanently, woven into the wards and the dome and the foundation stone and 63 house elves who had made a choice. That portion was not returnable and was not meant to be, but some of it was back in the Hogwarts stones, moving through the castle's infrastructure with the warmth of something restored rather than installed, recognized rather than new. The castle received it the way old things received what had once been part of them, without announcement, with the quiet certainty of return. When September came again, the Academy's second year began in full morning light. The dome opened to a sky that had decided, against Scotland's usual temperament, to be clear and generous with color. 163 students. The number had surprised no one paying attention. The ICW's exemplary educational practice designation had been published in February, and word had traveled the way it traveled when students went home for winter break and described something to younger siblings and cousins. Not as a general claim, but specific. Neville Longbottom asked the hedge what it wanted, and by morning the eastern approach had rearranged itself. I can light a candle with my open palm, and I've been able to do it for 6 weeks. They arrived in clusters on the dark sand beach, the Concordia Argenti visible in the apple trees above the shore, the dome catching the morning sun in those unnamed frequencies. Several stopped at the waterline with the expression of people feeling the island register their presence, recognizing it, knowing them back. Dobby was at the beach. He had been there since 5 in the morning, because an inaugural breakfast for a doubled student body required preparations that could not be rushed, and because Dobby held the view that arrivals deserved to find a place that had been ready for them. The founding ceremony for new students was Hermione's design. Not a sorting, not a division, a welcome. Each new student called by their full name, not shortened, not altered, by Harry and Hermione together at the hall center. A copy of the Emrys Codex placed in their hands as they were named, the founding document, the curriculum guide, the legal charter, and 4 final pages that were Hermione's own addition. She had been slightly self-conscious about those pages. Harry had told her they were the most important part. They began, "Magic is not a power to be allocated by those who happen to be holding authority at any given moment. It is yours. It has always been yours. We built this place to help you understand that." The ceremony ran 90 minutes. Shorter than it felt, because rooms where time moves at the pace of what is happening have that quality. By November of the second year, the Earth Magic Institute, Neville's designation, appearing in the Academy's second institutional prospectus and making him at 16 the youngest person to found a formal magical subdiscipline in the ICW's recorded history, had 3 visiting practitioners in residence. They had come from Bulgaria, Brazil, and a Welsh village that had been practicing Terramantic traditions for 200 years without knowing what to call them. Neville received them with the courtesy of someone more interested in what they knew than in the significance of their visiting, and the work they produced together over the autumn represented 6 months of progress that any of them would have taken 3 years to achieve independently. Fred and George's resonance post was in active use across 43 wizarding households by December. Patents filed through Gringotts' intellectual property division, 12 more households on a waiting list. They described the expansion of their workshop, in their formal funding request, as necessary for projects at a scale the original space was not designed to support. Hermione approved the request without asking what the projects were. Having developed a methodology for managing their work she described as informed oversight at a respectful distance, a phrase Fred had immediately told George was the best professional review they had ever received. The ICW annual review dedicated 6 pages to the Academy. The figures were factual and remarkable. At the end, in a paragraph the lead assessor had added at her own initiative, statistical measures, while accurate, do not fully capture the defining characteristic of this institution, which is the quality of attention its students bring to their work. This quality has been observed in 6 institutional assessments across 3 countries and was present here at a level the assessors have not previously encountered. It has been built into the institution, not discovered despite it. The Daily Prophet, on the day Sirius Black's exoneration was formally registered in the ICW's records, ran 3 stories. The exoneration, accurate and thorough. The pedigree capture, factual and complete, and a profile of the Academy of Emrys, whose final paragraph quoted from the founding document. Sirius read all 3 over breakfast. He didn't say anything. He ate. He looked out the hall window at the September morning. And later, at lunch, something that had been in his face since Azkaban. Not grief, precisely, but the particular shadow of a man who has been carrying a weight in his expression so long he's forgotten it was there, was simply absent. Lupin noticed. He didn't comment. He passed the salt. In October, a letter arrived from Neville, addressed to Hermione, written in handwriting that had improved significantly over 2 years, in a place that had taught him everything was worth developing. Hermione, the Eastern Garden is doing something new. The Snargaluff is waltzing again. I think the soil wants a greenhouse, but I want to ask it first. Neville, she filed it in the correspondence folder. then took it out and put it on her desk instead, because some things didn't belong in files. From a personal memo, undated, in Harry's handwriting, kept in a leather folder in the drawer of his desk in the hall, filed under things I want to remember, Sirius laughed today at breakfast. Actually laughed. The real kind. Lupin said something about the third-year primal casting session, and Sirius knocked over his tea. Dobby arrived with approximately 14 napkins before the tea finished moving. Hermione made a sound I will describe as laughter, and she will deny. The wards are warm. The island smells like apples. I'm going to teach third year's war magic this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to it. He taught it differently now than he had in the first year. The difference had a name. The third year's first morning. The cliff at dawn. The sea was silver gray, and the sky had not yet committed to its color. Behind them, the first lights coming on in the dormitory clusters. The movement of a community waking into a day it hadn't been promised, and was going to use regardless. Harry watched the water. Hermione sat at the low granite table they had placed at the cliff's edge in spring, notebook open, quill already moving. She had been writing before he arrived. Third edition, he said. I'm restructuring the legal section around what we learned from the reparations proceeding. The original sequencing didn't serve a first-time reader. He nodded. He watched the sea. She said, without looking up, we're not done. I know. The Horcrux situation, I know. Voldemort is, Hermione. He turned to look at her. I know. She looked up then. At him. Between them was the thing that had always been between them since the troll incident in their first year, since the 40-page document in the back booth of the Leaky Cauldron, since the lineage crucible and the foundation stone, and the Valentine's Day siege and 30 months of building something on an island that had been waiting for them to arrive. Not the performance of certainty. The actual thing. She said, "Good." He said, "Let's finish our tea first." She said, "You don't have tea." He held out his right palm. Open. And the morning air above it simply became something it hadn't been. No shimmer, no drama, no flourish. A cup materialized, solid, warm, entirely specific, with the quiet satisfaction of magic that understood it was being asked to do something ordinary, and found the ordinary worth doing. He raised his eyebrows. She raised hers. The grin arrived on his face first, unguarded and complete, the kind that belonged to moments when something worked correctly and the correctness was also funny. Then on hers, rare, full, the one she did not calibrate, that arrived before she could decide whether to let it. They stood on the cliff above the Academy of Emrys as the morning made its commitment to color, and the island woke beneath them, and the wards ran their patient circuit at the water's edge. It was exactly what they had built. It was theirs. The next problem existed, and they were not afraid of it. The sea was wide, the sky was clearing, the tea was warm. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.